Hello and welcome to New Scientist Weekly. We are, as they say, your curated selection of the week's science stories. Every week, we curate our butts off to bring you the most fascinating stories we can. And I'm Christy Taylor in New York.
And I'm Timothy Revel in London. This week on the podcast, we revisit an interstellar crash that left Earth exposed to radiation outside the sun's protection. Plus the impossible maths of Super Mario, yes, the game, and a new treasure trove of data that will help us understand the health effects of leaving Earth.
And a very special guest, author Naomi Klein, who is this year's winner of the Women's Prize for Nonfiction for her book Doppelganger, all about the online conspiracies and fictions that plague our lives.
But first, you may have already heard the amazing news this week of a study showing that African elephants have names for each other, just like we do. Which is pretty amazing if it's true. It would make them one of the first non-human animals where this has been documented, and maybe the first non-human species to use the names of other individuals in the same way as humans. We used to think it was a thing that only we did, but as is so often the case in the history of zoology, that could well turn out to be human hubris once again. Michael LePage, he's been reporting on this week for us. Michael, I cannot tell you just how excited I am about this. It's so incredible and amazing. But before I get a little bit too carried away, does the evidence stack up?
Yeah, it's an astounding claim, isn't it? And I think the evidence is pretty good. So to start at the beginning, it's long been known that elephants call to each other or greet each other with complex rumbles. Now, what Joyce Poole at Elephant Voices noticed is that these rumbles sometimes seem to be addressed to specific individuals. So one individual might make a call and then another elephant in the herd answers it, but the rest of the elephants just seem to ignore it. So we can hear one of the recordings that Poole made now.
Wow, that is quite some greeting. I mean, but how do we know that there is a name in there and it's not just the elephants kind of generically doing an elephanty hello?
Yeah, this is not something that anyone figured out just by ear alone. So what a team at Colorado State University did was to analyze more than 600 of the greeting calls recorded by Poole and others. So for each recording, they knew which elephant had made it and what other individual elephants they seemed to be addressing. And the team then did a whole bunch of analyses using AI, and they were able to predict which elephant was being addressed in a third of cases, which is a lot better than chance alone. But the really crucial part of the study is that they then played back the rumbles that appeared to include names to those specific individuals.
All right, so like a duck call or something like that. What happened? Were those elephants able to recognize that they were being addressed?
Yes, when they played these rumbles through a speaker, the individuals that these rumbles were addressed to, they responded more strongly. So they came up to the speaker faster than other elephants that were around. They made answering rumbles faster, and they also made more answering rumbles overall than the other elephants.
Okay, that sounds really convincing as far as data goes. So that's a good sign that these animals know that these specific calls are being addressed to them. Does that mean that their calls use names kind of the way that we would? You know, are these elephants saying the equivalent of, "Hey, Michael, how are things? Want to be on my podcast?"
Well, the team haven't been able to isolate the components of these rumbles that correspond to names. So we don't know whether these are relatively short and simple sounds like human names, but they certainly seem to work in the same way as human names. Now, another interesting thing that we don't know yet is whether different individuals use the same shared name for one specific individual. So it could be that each individual elephant has its own set of names for all the others in its herd, like individual nicknames or pet names.
That's so interesting. I feel like if it's either of those, it would be pretty amazing. I just imagine elephants giving each other unique names. That would be really very cool. Either way, though, we really don't know of other animals doing something quite like this, right, apart from us.
Well, there is some evidence that bottlenose dolphins and some birds can call to specific individuals and also that those individuals respond. But what's happening there is thought to be a bit different. So, for instance, each dolphin has got its own so-called signature whistle, which is a sound that it makes a lot. And then when another dolphin wants to attract the attention of an individual, they copy that individual's signature. So it acts like a name, but one dolphin isn't saying to another, "Hey, I'm going to call you Flipper from now on." Yeah, so the name's always a signature whistle. So it's a bit like if I went around saying, "Michael, Michael, 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 Michael," all the time. And then, it gets boring fast, doesn't it? But then anyone who wants to talk to me can say, "Hey, Michael." They don't need to learn my name in advance. And if you think about it, doing things this way has a lot of advantages. So imagine you're a bird living in a flock with thousands of other birds. You don't need to learn the names of all those other birds. But if every individual is shouting out its name all the time, you could just use it.
Certainly, it would remove those awkward times when you can't quite remember someone's name. When they walked up to you, they were just saying, Michael, 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 Michael. Oh, yeah, of course, you're Michael.
I have that problem more often than I would like to admit. Yeah, I can see how that would be useful to not have to memorize everybody's name, but it also would get really tiresome really fast. Like, Christy, 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 Christy. No offense, Michael. But it is kind of like having kids shouting each other's names nonstop. So what makes elephant communication perhaps more sophisticated than what we're talking about here?
Yes, so we know that elephants can mimic sounds if they want to, but they didn't find any evidence that they do in this case. So what seems to be happening is that they're coming up with arbitrary names. So it's as if one elephant is saying to another, right, I'm going to call you Dumbo, or I'm going to call you Big Ears. And that other elephant is going, yeah, all right, then that's my name now. So it's just like we come up with nicknames for people.
So does this tell us anything more about how smart elephants are?
I think it's already clear how smart and sophisticated elephants can be, but this certainly takes it up a notch. As you said, here we have elephants doing something that we thought was unique to humans. And Joyce Poole thinks there's a lot more to discover about elephant communication, about elephant language, if you like. For instance, she thinks that elephants might use place names too. They make these let's go rumbles when they get moving, and it's possible that those rumbles could actually be referring to specific places.
And presumably there's loads more to discover about other species as well. I mean, not just elephants. They may just be the tip of the elephanty iceberg.
Absolutely. So there are already some hints that a bird with the wonderful name of the green-rumped parrotlet uses names in quite a human-like way. And the big thing that's happening in the field is that lots of researchers are now starting to apply AI to analysing animal communications, just as they did in this case. So I think there are going to be a lot more discoveries made soon. Keep your ears peeled.
Today, we are not only going back in time, but also out to the edge of the solar system. Sometime between 2 and 3 million years ago, researchers think that the protective bubble that surrounds the sun and the planets, that's called the heliosphere, crashed into an almighty galactic cloud. And that may have had a massive impact here on Earth, too. Our reporter in Australia, James Woodford, has been covering this. Welcome back, James.
Hey, Christy. Thanks for having me.
So are we talking about like an ancient weather report for the universe? Cloudy with a chance of interstellar collisions? Tell us what this new study has found.
Actually, when I was writing this, it really made me think of the turbulence that passengers sometimes experience when they hit a storm in an aeroplane, except imagine a storm of galactic proportions and a storm that happened a long time ago. Basically, not only do Earth and the other planets orbit around the sun, but the sun and the whole solar system are traveling through the galaxy, which in turn is traveling through the universe. And the solar winds that are pumped out by the sun create a bubble or cocoon that encompasses the entire solar system. This is called the heliosphere, and it helps stop cosmic radiation from hitting us from throughout the universe. And naturally, that heliosphere, it moves with us as the solar system is moving through the galaxy. The interesting part of this and what's made this study possible is that it's only recently become possible using new satellites to begin to map where our solar system has traveled in the past and where it may be heading. And now, as part of that work, a team from Boston University in Massachusetts, led by Merav Ofer, has concluded that 2 to 3 million years ago, as you said, the heliosphere collided with a very dense and cold cloud.
Amazing. I love the idea of us sort of wrapped up in the heliosphere like a protective little cocoon. But let's talk about these clouds then. So they're out there beyond the solar system. What are they like? And what is cold and dense on sort of inter-solar system scales?
Yes. Look, they're not like clouds here on Earth. For a start, they're mostly hydrogen gas. And the one the heliosphere crossed paths with is called the local ribbon of cold clouds. And it's still out there moving around. And it's likely a remnant from a supernova explosion tens of light years away. Compared to what the rest of space is like in the interstellar medium beyond the solar system, these clouds, like the local ribbon of cold clouds, are freezing and dense. Currently, the interstellar medium outside the heliosphere is very warm, and it's actually got a temperature of around 7,000 degrees Celsius and a hydrogen density of just zero point 0.2 atoms per cubic centimeter. But on the other hand, inside the cold, dense clouds, the temperature is minus 263 degrees Celsius, and the density of hydrogen atoms is as high as 3,000 atoms per cubic centimeter. When this cloud hit the heliosphere, the energy involved was so intense that the protective bubble shrunk so far that Earth was actually outside its protective cocoon and, in fact, was in the interstellar medium.
Wow. Okay. So this just seems like an epic event that would have happened. And we see evidence that it happened. We can map it out. It also seems like there could have been consequences to Earth being outside the sun's protection, right? Do we have any other interesting data about what Earth was doing during this time period?
Absolutely. It's thought Earth may actually have been directly exposed to the interstellar medium and all of its radioactive particles for as long as 10,000 years. And at the same time as this event occurred, there's a big spike in iron and plutonium isotopes found in lunar samples, Antarctic ice cores, and sediments in the deep ocean, which provides further evidence that this collision actually took place.
Wow. And yeah, Earth wasn't empty at this time. There was life on Earth 2 to 3 million years ago. We're talking the Pliocene or the Pleistocene eras, woolly mammoths, giant sloths, everything like that. Do the researchers have any thoughts on what impact this might have had on life on Earth when this occurred?
Yes, well, it was a critical time for the ancestors of our species, and as you said, many other animals and all life on Earth as well. And the researchers believe that this event would not only have had a big impact on Earth's climate and therefore on evolution by dramatically changing the weather, but there would have also been an upsurge of cosmic radiation hitting our planet and potentially directly mutating DNA. But at the moment, the impacts of this cold cloud are ideas that need to be explored, and the scientists are hoping to begin work on that as the next stage of their research.
All right. So a lot more to be understood, but it sounds like the lesson at the very least is to maybe keep your seatbelt fastened while you're flying through the universe.
Yes, and perhaps keep your radiation suit and thermals nearby.
Time for a quick break. Next week on Culture Lab, we're tackling something on the serious side. Former New Scientist journalist Layal Liverpool has a new book out exploring racism worldwide and how it hurts the health of people in marginalised groups, and actually everyone else too. She covers everything from the ways medical research leaves out black and brown people to the underlying stress of living in a racist society.
The book is called Systemic, and I got to talk to her all about it. While the book is grim and it's telling of the harms of social bias, Layal does a lot of really great work revealing the ways people are also working to fix these systems. And that's all coming up in your feed on Tuesday.
And if you want to learn how artificial intelligence is transforming industrial performance and efficiency, make sure you listen to the latest episode of New Scientist Collab. We meet Pia Schloms, a woman who is driving the sustainable industrial revolution. Sponsored by Siemens, this podcast showcases the power of industrial AI to solve complex engineering problems while also reducing their environmental impact. Find New Scientist Collab wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Now, the Women's Prize for Nonfiction was awarded this week to Naomi Klein for her book Doppelganger, her incisive take on online politics, fake news, and the dangers of social media. Our own Rowan Hooper caught up with her after the award ceremony.
Naomi, thanks for joining us. Congratulations on the win. The subtitle of the book, Doppelganger, it's a trip into the mirror world. And I thought, for those who don't know, can you set it up for us? What is the mirror world?
Sure. And thank you. It's great to be with you. So the mirror world is the term I use to describe conspiracy land and sort of what is happening on the alt-right, the sort of wellness right. It's sometimes described as a diagonal political alliance between the New Age left and the far right that really consolidated in the COVID years. And this book starts from the interesting little detail that I have a doppelganger, somebody who I have been confused and conflated with for over a decade now. Another nonfiction writer named Naomi Wolf, who, your listeners may know as a prominent liberal feminist, wrote a book called The Beauty Myth that had a big influence on me when I was an undergraduate, but who is one of these people who has crossed over to the right from the left and is really a major disseminator of medical misinformation and disinformation, which took off during the pandemic. So I just use that as a way in. She's kind of like the white rabbit leading me down the rabbit hole, but the book is on the rabbit hole, and that's what I mean by the mirror world, a world where Naomi's have gone wild.
I mean, it's not a typical science book that we would talk about at New Scientist, but it actually read more like a horror story to me. It was like, oh my God. But it is about reality, about the nature of the self, and those are things that we're interested in. So can you give us a flavor of something that you've learned about people, about psychology, through this investigation into down the rabbit hole?
One thing that springs to mind is this fascination with doubles, with doppelgangers, is quite long running. We've always, as a species, been interested in twins because they challenge the singularity of the self. And I think at this late stage in the capitalist story, we put so much onto the self, and we expect so much from the self, and we do so much to perfect and optimize ourselves because we do feel precarious and insecure within a system that doesn't offer us much of a net by way of social safety, by way of jobs or pensions. So we want so much from ourselves. And so the idea that there might be another self out there, another you who the world is confusing for you, that it creates a particular kind of instability. But the figure of the double, of the doppelganger, really runs through Western literature and film. And the first piece of major theory that was written trying to understand why so many writers and filmmakers returned to the figure of the doppelganger was by Otto Rank, who is a student of Freud's. And he had various theories, including that it was a way of dealing with fears of mortality, that the original double is the soul that outlives the self when we die. But it's striking that he wrote that essay at the start of the First World War. And it's sometimes been speculated that in times where we feel particularly unstable as a society, when things are really shifting, during times of war, we might add, in the midst of a climate crisis, that we turn to the figure of the double to sort of give expression to our deepest fears of vertigo and instability.
I mean, we can build origin stories about why individual people flip into the mirror world, but what about why it's more generally become so widespread? Is it, as you say, like a time of multiple crises going on?
Yeah.
And what about the role of social media? Because it feels like it wasn't always like as bad as this.
It is a major factor. And I have been, as a journalist, I've covered shocks and crises over the years. I wrote a book about shocks called The Shock Doctrine that, it really began with 9/11, with trying to understand the way the shock of those terror attacks redrew the political map, changed the subject, and it looked at political change in the aftermath of large-scale crises and shocks. And one thing I can say is that conspiracy theories often surge when something happens that is a rupture in our collective story. Like all a shock isn't just something big happening, it's something big happening seemingly out of the blue that we don't yet have a story to explain. And as humans, we become very destabilized when something happens for which we do not have a story. 9/11 was like that, right?
Yeah.
And we heard immediately, 9/11 changes everything. That's pre-9/11 thinking, right? It was a true rupture. Yeah. The financial crisis of 2008 was a little bit like that. And COVID was certainly like that. In my experience of covering these shocks, there are always conspiracies that surge in those moments because we are looking for a story. And so whoever has a good story is going to get a lot of traction. So that did have to happen after 9/11. There were all kinds of conspiracies about it being an inside job and so on. Hurricane Katrina, which flooded New Orleans, there were conspiracies about, well, maybe the government detonated the levees because they wanted to get rid of public housing. I heard conspiracies after the Asian tsunami that maybe it was caused by a nuclear explosion. But COVID was different. And I think, as you say, it had a lot to do with social media, and not just in the sense that it connects us and allows wild theories to spread. It was that this was a monetizable disaster in the sense that because social media allows attention to be monetized, it means that you could build your platform very, very quickly if you claim to have the cure, if you claim to know that Bill Gates actually wanted to inject you with a tracking device.
Yeah.
So it was that combination of a virus that was novel, fear, isolation, people going online to try to find some simulation of the community that we missed, and having a lot of grifters who were ready to just basically say anything to build their platforms or sell their tinctures.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you about that. There are grifters who are doing it for money and power. Well, that's what they're all doing it for. But do these people believe this stuff, or are they just constructing the conspiracy or promoting it in order to make themselves money and power?
Well, that is something that I can't really answer. I mean, I'm not
Mm.
inside. I'm not
Steve
inside
Bannon's head.
Steve
Yeah.
Bannon, or InfoWars is big business.
Yeah.
They also, a lot of these folks sell, in addition to monetizing attention, they're also often selling supplements in particular are a big revenue stream for a lot of these. I call them conspiracy influencers because there really isn't a theory that is stable. The theory moves around depending on where you're going to get the traction. So, one minute they're railing against masks because COVID is just a cold. Why are you even worried about it? And the next minute, COVID is a bioweapon,
Yeah.
and it was all cooked up to destroy the West. What is clear, though, is that you're only able to grift, you're only able to make a lot of money off of people's attention and off of their fear if they believe you. So there's clearly an audience, and most people who are consumers of conspiracy culture are not making a fortune from it.
Right.
They're just turning to these influencers because they're trying to make sense of the world. And that's where I think things get complicated because they are tapping into something real. I often say that conspiracy culture gets the facts wrong, but the feelings right. And so they're very much tapping into a feeling that something isn't right, that we live in a time of huge wealth creation, of billionaires beyond all imagining. We'll probably live to see our first trillionaire soon. And yet everything that supports people's well-being seems to be eroding, and so there's a feeling of that this system is rigged, it's not working. And so what conspiracy culture does is it takes that rightful sense, maybe the system is rigged against you, and says, well, it's just those 5 people over there. It's Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum, and maybe some lizard people, and maybe some Jews too. I mean, and there's a room somewhere. And if we could, and this is why I think conspiracy, even though the posture of conspiracy culture is anti-elite, we're taking on the powerful, it's actually quite a great gift to the biggest winners in this economy because it detracts attention from any kind of a systemic analysis of why we have these perennial and deepening inequalities in our society and injustices, real injustices.
I mean, is that the way to start tackling it, is to understand the feelings that make people buy into this?
Well, or better yet, for there to be real solutions to the underlying, and I think just sense that this system is broken. I think about the Brexit slogan.
I was just going to mention,
But I live in Canada, and we have a far right politician who's running on a platform, Canada is broken. He doesn't plan on fixing it. But that doesn't mean he isn't tapping into something real, right? People are paying their taxes. Cost of living is higher and higher. Our healthcare system is being eroded like yours. So I think when people are feeling more and more stressed and burdened, then these charlatan figures, I would call them charlatans, who tap into the feeling, but then redirect it towards the immigrant, towards the unhoused, the most vulnerable. So it really is a pivot because it sets itself up as taking on the powerful, but then it ends up just The only thing it can really offer are the sort of pleasures of being slightly better off than somebody else, which is a pleasure. It's a kind of pleasure. And I think we can't discount the fact that if there aren't real solutions on offer, people will settle for a scapegoat because it's something. It's at least something.
Great. Look, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Naomi. And congratulations again on the prize. That was great stuff.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure to speak with you.
That was Rowan speaking with Naomi Klein, who has just won the Women's Prize for Nonfiction for her book, Doppelganger.
Next up, health reporter Claire Wilson wrote this week about a new initiative that could help our understanding of what happens to your body when you go to space. Ever since the first mission sending humans off our planet, we've been learning that it's not exactly easy on us. There are consequences for your bone density, immune system, and even your eyeballs. But studying these issues relies on data from the very small number of people who have actually been sent into space, the astronauts. Claire, you got to speak to the astronauts themselves this week. I hope this means you actually got to go into space yourself.
Oh, I wish I had. I did meet them virtually, though, if that counts. They were holding a press conference about a new space biobank. Now, what is a space biobank, I hear you ask?
You're very clairvoyant, Claire. What is a space biobank?
Thank you. A biobank is the term for a repository of biological samples like blood, urine, feces, skin biopsies, and so on, as well as results of a whole host of medical tests on people, usually the same people who donated those samples. This space biobank is a collection of these samples and data from as many as possible of all the people who have ever been to space, either on the International Space Station or people who have been on, various missions like SpaceX's Inspiration 4 mission from 2021, for instance. They weren't quite clear on how many people these samples have come from, but Chris Mason, one of the researchers, put it at about 70. Now, that would be about a tenth of all the people who have ever been in space. So they want it to continue growing to become a resource for researchers to use in future.
Yeah, and I remember when the Kelly twins, Mark and Scott, they were used as a kind of twin experiment in astronaut health. One of them went to space for a year, and the other stayed home and did Earth things. And those poor men had to, submit to sampling to high heaven for months and months after Scott came back. Now, I imagine as we send more people to space, we will be able to make this database bigger, too, and sort of save the burden on individual astronauts. So what do they hope to find out from such a vast collection?
Well, it's clear that spaceflight can have impacts on the body. So it's fairly well known that due to the lack of gravity, astronauts lose bone density and muscle mass. Now, down here on Earth, our muscles are constantly working against gravity to keep us upright and let us walk around. We all know the phrase use it or lose it, right? So they're not using their muscles in the same ways at all when they're up in space. You might have seen clips of astronauts on the ISS doing exercises to try to combat that.
Yeah, there are loads of videos of astronauts doing that because they spend an awful lot of time exercising. And then there's also that famous clip from 2001: A Space Odyssey where one of the astronauts is just running loops around the ship.
Oh, yeah. So, and in real life, they have to use a running machine, of course, and they also have something a bit like an exercise bike. But of course, they have to be strapped in place to use them. And they have to do this sort of thing for 2 hours a day.
Wow.
And yeah, that's an awful lot. So scientists have long been investigating other ways to help make the exercise process more efficient so it would take up less time. They haven't come up with anything yet, although actually, I once took a trip on the European Space Agency's Vomit Comet. That plane, when they get a plane to do parabolas, and that means the people on board have short periods of weightlessness. And that was to accompany some scientists who were studying the effects of zero gravity on people as they exercise to try and improve how astronauts exercise in future.
Whoa, what was that actually like? And what did they find out? What does it teach us about health in astronauts?
Well, on that particular trip, they didn't come up with any great breakthroughs, I'm afraid, but my Gosh, it was just an amazing, unique experience, which, like, all the way through, it was probably one of the most exciting things I've ever done as a journalist. It was mostly a lot of fun, although towards the end, I did live up to the name of the flight and I did start vomiting. And that part wasn't so fun, unsurprisingly. I would do it again, though, in a heartbeat.
So one thing they found out was how to make a biomed reporter throw up.
Yes, quite a lot of people threw up on it, actually. So if you want to read that article, we can put a link to that in the show notes. But I think we should go back to the real astronauts here. So muscle loss isn't the only problem that they have. We've previously had studies that showed that astronauts are more prone to heart disease in later life than others. There's also a bizarre effect that their eyesight often worsens while they're in space if they're up there for any length of time. Now, we used to think that was just their eyeballs kind of temporarily taking on a different shape due to, the lack of gravity and fluid changes in their body. That probably does contribute, but other things seem to be going on too. Some astronauts seem to get damage to their retinas, and we don't really know why that is. And unfortunately, in some people, it doesn't reverse when they come home.
Oh, that's unfortunate. Do they feel like it was worth it, though, to still go up into space?
Well, I don't know. I don't know that anybody's been interviewed on that specific question. I mean, they might feel it was worth it, you could imagine. Mysteries like these are all part of the reason why we need this space biobank, and we need to understand more about the health impacts of spaceflight, especially as governments and private companies are gearing up to send more people to more distant parts of the solar system. So the space biobank is kind of one more step down that road. The more data that they have, the more scientists who are studying it, the more insights we'll hopefully have into understanding, what kind of health risks humans will face when we eventually leave the planet.
And we're back with the news that Super Mario Bros. Is a computational puzzle that is impossible, not just hard, to solve with even the world's most powerful supercomputer. Now, the question is, does this refer to the game itself being hard to play or something else? Matt Sparks is here to tell us all about it, and I suspect there'd be quite a few gamers out there who are in fact solving this puzzle every time they play. So, Matt, what is going on?
So this is essentially about a field of research known as complexity theory, which looks at the nature of problems solved by computers, and it categorizes them all based on how difficult they are and how quickly they get more difficult as you scale up the size of the problem. And there are loads of these categories. They all subdivide and overlap and then mingle, which, all the categories mean different things. But back in 2012, we covered a story about the problem of computationally determining whether a level in Mario could be completed, whether it was possible to complete it. And the researchers then proved that it was in a category called MP hard, which means it has complexity which grows exponentially. So that basically means that it was really counterintuitively difficult for a computer to do that, especially as the levels got bigger.
That makes sense. And now we've got a study that takes that even further, right? From being really, really difficult to being literally impossible.
Exactly. Yeah, it's the same group of researchers at MIT, and this new research shows that there are some games, including Super Mario Bros. And Super Mario Maker, where you can prove that it is computationally impossible to determine if a level can be played right through to the end. And one of the authors of the paper told me that this work is a kind of sequel to the previous work, but it's also the end because you can't get any harder than impossible. You could literally take the world's biggest, most powerful supercomputer, set it on the task for a dozen years, and it couldn't solve the problem.
I can see how that would be a really interesting rabbit hole for researchers to go down. And also, if I had personally beaten one of these games, I would now feel even more proud of myself for doing something a supercomputer couldn't. But is complexity theory often troubling itself with computer games? I mean, presumably it's more concerned with real-world problems that do something useful. No offense to the gamers, of course.
Yeah, normally, yes, it is. So complexity theory, it's a really useful area because if we can do some clever trickery and shift a common problem from one category to another with some sort of nifty algorithmic work, then we could potentially shift all of the problems from that category into an easier category. But, computer games are a fun diversion if you're working in this field. And one of the researchers told me that we don't know how to prove that a game is fun, but we do know how to prove that it's hard. And maybe there's some sort of correlation between tricky games and fun games. But really, this is, it's just research for research's sake, really.
So behind the scenes, we're applying a supercomputer, but what's actually going on to prove how hard or impossible this calculation is?
Okay, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. So firstly, they had to break a few rules to make this work. First of all, they had to alter the game ever so slightly. They had to lift a limit that was placed by the developers on the number of baddies that you can have in any given level. And they also had to create custom levels. So once that's done, they created a few spots in the game with huge numbers, hundreds, thousands of enemies all on one spot. And those spots were sort of conceptualized as counters, with an integer represented by the number of enemies on that spot. Then those counters allowed them to create an abstract mathematical tool called a counter machine, which essentially creates a functional computer within the game itself, a computer that can, run code. Then they added another layer of trickery by invoking the halting problem, which says that in general, there's no way to determine if any given computer program will ever terminate or simply run forever, other than just running it to see what happens. But they ran that actually on the virtual computer within a game made of piles of baddies. Now, these layers of mathematical concepts finally allowed the team to prove that no analysis of the game level can say for sure whether or not it can never be completed.
So, to summarize, they used layer after layer of complex math and computer science, standing on the shoulders of giants, to create a mathematical proof about Super Mario Bros. Being impossible to analyze by supercomputers for no real practical reason. Cool?
Yeah, that's science.
All right, that's it for this week. You can read all the stories we've talked about today in the show notes, and there's much more like it on our website, newscientist.com.
Plus, if you like the great stories we're bringing you, and they are always great, please give us a rating or review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Share your favorite stories with all your friends, maybe via a low-frequency rumble, or maybe just throw up a tweet about them. We'll be back next week. Bye for now.
Bye. Tim.
Christy.
This podcast is produced by OG Podcasts. Find out more at ogpodcasts.co.uk.